Have you ever wondered why it sometimes feels like God is far away, even when you maintain your unwavering faith? In our spiritual journey, there are subtle habits that silently build invisible barriers between us and God's presence. Like a gentle current slowly pulling a boat away from shore, these behaviors can distance us from intimacy with God without us even realizing it. In a world where every second is filled with endless notifications, appointments, and distractions, it becomes even more challenging to maintain our vibrant and authentic spiritual connection. However, there is transformative hope. By identifying and understanding these habits, we can rewrite our spiritual story and regain intimacy with the Father. Imagine Sophia, a dedicated 32-year-old professional who has always prided herself on her unwavering faith. Every morning, she woke up determined to face the challenges of the day. Her alarm clock would go off at 6 o'clock, and her fingers would immediately reach for her phone. Not to pray, but to check her emails, text messages, and social media. This seemingly harmless routine was, day after day, creating an invisible chasm between her and God. The first and most silent habit that leads us away from God is precisely this: starting the day without prayer. As Proverbs 3 verse 6 teaches us, "In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will direct your paths." This verse is not just a spiritual suggestion, but a fundamental principle for a life aligned with God's purposes. When we neglect to pray in the morning, it is as if we set off on a long journey without consulting the GPS. We may reach our destination, but the journey will certainly be more difficult and full of unnecessary detours. Morning prayer is not just a religious ritual. It is a sacred moment of spiritual alignment where we establish the right priorities for our day. In my research on the impact of morning prayer on the lives of Christians, I've come across extraordinary stories of transformation, like that of Ricardo, a tech entrepreneur who faced crucial decisions on a daily basis. For years, he would start his mornings by diving straight into financial reports and strategy meetings. The stress was constant, and decisions always seemed unclear. It was during a particularly challenging crisis in his company that Ricardo realized the need for change. Inspired by a spiritual mentor, he decided to do a 40-day experiment. He would dedicate the first 30 minutes of each morning exclusively to prayer and meditation on the Word. The results were astonishing. The first few days were a real struggle, Ricardo shares. My mind was constantly wandering to the day's tasks, and my phone seemed to be ringing every few minutes. But I persisted, and something extraordinary began to happen. I noticed that decisions that had previously seemed impossible began to become clearer. It was as if a higher wisdom was guiding my thoughts. The transformation was not limited to professional aspects. Ricardo noticed a significant change in his family relationships and in the way he dealt with stress. Before, I would come home exhausted, with no energy for my wife and children. Now, even on intense days, I feel an inner peace that allows me to be truly present for my family. This testimony leads us to reflect deeply on how we start our days. How many of us, like Sophia at the beginning of our story, allow technology and the demands of the modern world to hijack our first moments? The statistics are alarming. Recent studies indicate that 79% of people check their smartphones within the first 5 minutes of waking up. When we allow notifications, emails, and social media to dominate our first thoughts, we unconsciously establish a dangerous hierarchy in our lives. We place the demands of the world above our need for connection with the divine. It's as if we're saying to God, "Wait a minute, I have more pressing matters to attend to." The truth is this reversal of priorities has profound consequences for our spiritual life. Like a plant that needs sunlight at dawn to grow strong and healthy, our soul needs the first moment of the day to feed on the presence of God. When we neglect this principle, we begin to experience subtle symptoms of spiritual deficiency. Maria, a 45-year-old teacher, shared her experience with this reality. "I had always considered myself a dedicated Christian, but I realized that I was living on autopilot. I attended church services, read my Bible occasionally, but I felt an inexplicable emptiness. That's when a spiritual retreat challenged me to rethink my morning routine. She decided to establish a sacred time as soon as she woke up. No cell phone, television, or any other distractions. The first 15 minutes would be dedicated exclusively to prayer and gratitude. At first, it seemed impossible. My mind was so conditioned to noise and agitation that silence bothered me. But persisting in this practice completely changed my spiritual life. Mary's testimony brings us to another fundamental aspect of morning prayer: gratitude. Beginning the day by expressing gratitude to God not only places us in the right position of humility and gratitude, but also opens the door to experiencing more of God's presence in our lives. Psalm 100 verse 4 teaches us, "Enter his gates with thanksgiving, and his courts with praise. Give thanks to him, and bless his name." This biblical principle reveals that gratitude is a key that opens spiritual doors. When we begin our day with thanksgiving, even for the little things, we create an atmosphere conducive to the manifestation of God's presence. Continuing directly from the last paragraph on gratitude, this morning gratitude practice is not only a spiritual exercise, but a powerful tool for mental transformation. Neuroscience studies have shown that expressing gratitude as soon as you wake up can significantly alter your brain patterns, preparing you to face the challenges of the day with a more positive and balanced outlook. Pedro, a 53-year-old surgeon, shared how implementing this practice has revolutionized his routine at the hospital. Before, I would arrive at the operating room already carrying the weight of worries and responsibilities. Each surgery was an additional source of stress. When I began dedicating the first moments of my day to prayer and gratitude, I noticed a significant change in my ability to deal with pressure. He developed a simple but profound ritual. Before he even got out of bed, Pedro would give thanks for 5 specific blessings in his life. I would begin by giving thanks for the gift of life, for the opportunity to serve through medicine, for my family, for the divine wisdom in each procedure, and for the team I work with. This practice has completely changed my professional perspective. Peter's experience leads us to a fundamental truth. Morning prayer is not only a time to speak to God, but also to allow him to speak to us. In the silence of the early morning hours, our minds are most receptive to divine guidance. It is during this time that we often receive guidance for important decisions and discernment for challenging situations. Anna, a 28-year-old entrepreneur, discovered this truth in a life-changing way. Facing a crucial decision in her business, she found herself paralyzed by fear and uncertainty. I had 2 partnership proposals on the table, both of which seemed promising. Rationally, it was impossible to decide which one to choose. It was during her morning prayer time that Anna received the clarity she needed. One particular morning, while praying, I felt an inexplicable peace about one of the options. It wasn't an audible voice or a dramatic revelation, but an inner certainty that can only come from God. The decision she made that morning proved pivotal in the growth of her business. This testimony shows us another vital aspect of morning prayer, its ability to prepare us spiritually for the challenges we will face. As it is written in Ephesians 6 verse 11, we are instructed to put on the complete armor of God, that you may be able to stand against the wiles of the devil. Morning prayer is the time when we put on this spiritual armor. Lucas, a 39-year-old college professor, shared how this morning spiritual preparation has protected him in times of temptation. I work in a predominantly secular environment where my faith is constantly challenged. I found that on days when I neglected my morning prayer, I was more vulnerable to negative influences and more likely to compromise my values. He then developed a specific strategy for his morning prayer. I take time to pray for spiritual protection, wisdom in words, and discernment in relationships. I ask God to use me as an instrument of his light in that environment. This practice has made all the difference in my Christian testimony. Luke's story reminds us that morning prayer is not only for our personal benefit, but also to enable us to be channels of God's presence to others. When we begin our day in communion with the Father, we naturally become carriers of his peace and love to those around us. Julia, a mother of 3 and project manager, discovered how her morning prayer impacted not only her life, but her entire family dynamic. I noticed that on the days I started with prayer, I had more patience with the kids, more wisdom in dealing with conflicts at work, and more energy to face challenges. She set a special time, 30 minutes before the rest of the family wakes up. This time has become sacred to me. It's not only when I pray for my family and work, but I also receive strength and direction to be a better mother, wife, and professional. The impact was so significant that her children began to notice a difference in her behavior. Julia's transformation in life brings us to another important dimension of morning prayer: its ability to create a positive ripple effect in our relationships. When we prioritize this time with God, we naturally become more patient, understanding, and loving people. Roberto, a 48-year-old executive, shared how his professional life was revolutionized after establishing a consistent morning prayer routine. Before, I was known for my explosive temper and aggressive way of dealing with problems. My team lived in constant tension. The change began when he decided to dedicate the first 45 minutes of his day to prayer and meditation on the Word. I began asking God not only for business results, but most importantly for a transformed heart. Gradually, I noticed that my leadership was becoming more compassionate and effective. Roberto's testimony illustrates a fundamental principle. Morning prayer not only connects us to God, but it also transforms us into His image. As it is written in 2 Corinthians 3 verse 18, "And we all, who with unveiled face contemplate the glory of the Lord, are being transformed into His image with ever-increasing glory." This transformation doesn't happen overnight. It's a gradual process that requires consistency and commitment. Many give up after a few tries, frustrated that they don't see immediate results. However, those who persevere discover that morning prayer is like a seed that, when watered daily, produces abundant fruit in its own time. Marina, a 35-year-old nurse, discovered this truth through her own journey. At first, it was frustrating. I would wake up determined to pray, but my mind would constantly wander. Sometimes I would fall asleep during prayer or find myself thinking about the day's to-do list. Her persistence, however, eventually bore unexpected fruit. After 3 months of consistent practice, she began to notice subtle but significant changes. It was as if a spiritual muscle was being strengthened. My concentration during prayer improved, and I began to develop a greater sensitivity to the voice of God. Her work in the hospital emergency department was also impacted by this new spiritual discipline. Amidst the chaos of the emergency room, I realized I had a new ability to stay calm and bring peace to patients. Colleagues began to notice and ask what my secret was. Marina discovered that her morning prayer not only prepared her spiritually, but also equipped her to be an instrument of healing and comfort in her workplace. This professional dimension of morning prayer is particularly relevant today. In an increasingly stressful and competitive corporate world, the ability to maintain emotional balance and mental clarity becomes a significant differentiator. As it is written in Isaiah 26 verse 3, "You will keep in perfect peace him whose mind is stayed on you, because he trusts in you." Carlos, a 44-year-old attorney, experienced this reality firsthand. Specializing in complex corporate law cases, he often faced high-pressure, high-conflict situations. Before I established my morning prayer routine, I would carry the stress of my cases home with me. My sleep was irregular, and anxiety was a constant companion. The change began when he decided to arrive at the office an hour early, not to work, but to pray. I turned my office into a little sanctuary in the early hours of the morning. There, before the phone started ringing and the emails started coming in, I would seek God's presence. The results were beyond his expectations. Not only did my stress level decrease significantly, but I also found myself gaining surprising insights into solving seemingly impossible cases. Carlos discovered that the divine wisdom he sought in the early hours of the day manifested itself at crucial moments in his professional activities. An often overlooked aspect of morning prayer is its ability to reorder our priorities. When we devote the first moments of our day to God, we naturally begin to see life from a higher perspective. Concerns that once seemed monumental begin to find a rightful place on our scale of values. Beatrice, a 37-year-old entrepreneur and single mother, shared how this reordering of priorities transformed her life. I was constantly torn between the demands of work and the needs of my children. Guilt was a constant feeling, no matter where I was or what I was doing. It was during her morning prayer times that she began to receive guidance in balancing her responsibilities. I learned to turn my day over to God and trust Him to multiply my time and resources. I began to see miracles happen in the management of my schedule. She developed the habit of making her priority lists during her prayer time. It was not just a planning exercise, but a time to seek God's wisdom for each decision. I learned to distinguish between the urgent and the truly important. Beatrice's experience reminds us of Jesus' words in Matthew 6, verse 33. Seek first the kingdom of God and His righteousness, and all these things will be given to you as well. This principle is practically manifested when we prioritize morning prayer. Continuing directly from the last paragraph on the principle in Matthew 6, verse 33, this pursuit of the kingdom first manifests itself in practical ways when we make morning prayer a non-negotiable priority. Fernando, a 42-year-old businessman, discovered this in a surprising way. I always used the excuse that I didn't have time to pray in the morning. My schedule was too tight, with meetings starting at 7 o'clock. The change came after a financial crisis that led him to rethink his priorities. I decided to do a radical experiment. Wake up an hour earlier, at 5 in the morning, exclusively to pray. I thought it would be impossible to maintain this rhythm, but something extraordinary happened. Fernando noticed that, paradoxically, the more time he spent praying in the morning, the more productive his day became. It was as if time multiplied. Meetings that used to drag on for hours became more active and efficient. Decisions that used to paralyze me for days now flowed with surprising clarity. This experience brings home a profound spiritual principle. When we honor God with the first fruits of our time, He honors our efforts in inexplicable ways. As Proverbs 3 verses 9 to 10 says, the principle of first fruits applies not only to material resources, but to every aspect of our lives. Helena, a 34-year-old visual artist, has experienced this truth in her creative career. I always believed that I needed to be inspired to create, and I often waited for the perfect moment. Ironically, my productivity was irregular, and I often felt creatively blocked. It was when she established a morning prayer routine that she discovered a new dimension of her creativity. I began to dedicate the first hour of the day to prayer and meditation on the Word. During these times, I did not specifically ask for artistic inspiration, but rather sought a genuine connection with the Creator. The result was transformative. I realized that my art began to flow from a deeper place. I was no longer dependent on momentary inspirations, but on a constant source of creativity that came from communion with God. His works began to convey a spiritual depth that touched people in unique ways. Helena's testimony reminds us that morning prayer is not just a religious exercise, but a transformative encounter with the creative God. In Genesis, we see that God is presented first as Creator, and when we connect with Him in the early hours of the day, we touch this creative dimension of His nature. Paul, a 51-year-old college professor, discovered how this principle applied to teaching. I had always considered myself a good teacher, but after establishing a consistent morning prayer routine, I noticed a significant change in my ability to connect with students. He began dedicating part of his morning prayer specifically to his students and his classes. It wasn't just a general prayer, but a time of true intercession. It brought each student before God, especially those who were struggling. The impact was beyond his expectations. I began to receive surprising insights during class, different ways of explaining complex concepts. More than that, I developed a greater sensitivity to notice when a student was going through personal difficulties. His classroom became not only a space for academic learning, but for personal transformation. Paul's experience illustrates another vital aspect of morning prayer: its ability to make us more sensitive to the needs of others. When we begin our day in communion with God, we naturally develop a more compassionate and caring heart for others. Mariana, a 46-year-old psychologist, has noticed this transformation in her clinical practice. Before, I approached each therapy session primarily with my professional tools and learned techniques. After establishing a deep morning prayer routine, I found myself developing a greater capacity to truly listen to my patients. She developed a specific practice in her morning prayer. I began to intercede for each patient I would see throughout the day, not just for their presenting problems, but for a true understanding of their deepest needs. This approach brought a new dimension to her therapeutic work. On several occasions, I found myself asking questions or offering insights that seemed to come from a wisdom beyond my professional training. Patients often commented on how truly understood and cared for they felt. Mariana found that her morning prayer not only prepared her spiritually, but also enhanced her professional skills. This phenomenon is not limited to the caregiving professions. Ricardo, a 48-year-old civil engineer, shared how his morning prayer practice has transformed his approach to construction sites. Construction is a naturally tense environment, with tight deadlines and many potential conflicts. I have started to include in my morning prayers specific requests for wisdom to deal with these situations. The result was a noticeable change in the atmosphere on his projects. I found myself better equipped to mediate conflicts between teams, more patient with inevitable delays, and more creative in finding solutions. His employees began to notice the difference, commenting on how the work environment had become more harmonious. Richard's experience brings us to another fundamental aspect of morning prayer: its ability to prepare us for the unexpected challenges of the day. As it is written in James 1 verse 5, "If any of you lacks wisdom, he should ask God, who gives generously to all without reproach, and it will be given to him." Camila, a 45-year-old judge, has experienced this truth profoundly. Each day in court brings complex cases and decisions that profoundly impact people's lives. I began dedicating an hour of prayer before each session, seeking not only wisdom, but also discernment to see beyond the proceedings. This practice transformed his judicial practice. I discovered a greater ability to perceive nuances in each case, to identify when there was more to the story beyond the court records. My search was not just for the cold application of the law, but for a justice that reflected divine wisdom. The impact of her transformed approach was noticed by lawyers and court staff. People began to comment on how the hearings had a different, more human atmosphere, while maintaining all the necessary legal rigor. Camila attributes this transformation directly to her morning prayer practice. This principle of transformation through morning prayer is not limited to the professional environment. Rodrigo, a father of 3 teenagers, has discovered how this habit has revolutionized his family life. Being a father of teenagers is a constant challenge. Each day brings new situations that require wisdom and patience beyond my natural capabilities. He developed the habit of praying specifically for each child during his morning devotions. It wasn't just a general prayer for protection, but a time of true intercession, seeking to understand the unique challenges each one faced. This practice brought a new dimension to his fatherhood. I began to notice that I was more in tune with my children's emotional needs. Conversations that had previously ended in conflict turned into moments of true connection. Rodrigo found that his morning prayer not only brought him closer to God, but also strengthened his family bonds. This relational dimension of morning prayer is particularly meaningful in our digital age, where genuine human connection has become increasingly rare. Luciana, a 39-year-old marketing executive, discovered this in a surprising way.